June 8, 793 AD. The monks of Lindisfarne never saw them coming. By sunset, their monastery was ash, their brothers were dead, and the Viking age had begun with blood and fire. But who were these men who would terrorize Europe for 3 centuries? To understand the Vikings, you have to understand where they came from. Scandinavia in the late 8th century was a land of extremes. Long, brutal winters. Short growing seasons. Fjords that cut deep into the mountains, isolating communities from one another. This wasn't a land that gave up its riches easily. The Norse people who lived here were farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen. They weren't born warriors. They were born survivors. And survival in Scandinavia meant being resourceful, tough, and willing to take risks. But there was a problem. The population was growing. Good farmland was scarce. Inheritance laws meant that only the eldest son got the family land. So what happened to everyone else? They looked to the sea. And the Norse had a secret weapon that would change everything, the longship. These weren't just boats. They were engineering marvels. Sleek, fast, and shallow enough to sail up rivers but sturdy enough to cross the North Sea. They could beach anywhere. No port needed. No warning given. The longship turned every coastline in Europe into a potential target. By the late 700s, the conditions were perfect for expansion. Scandinavia had skilled sailors, advanced shipbuilding technology, a growing population of young men with no inheritance, and neighbors to the south who were wealthy, divided, and completely unprepared. The Vikings weren't just going to raid. They were going to reshape the medieval world. That first raid on Lindisfarne was a shock to the Christian world. The attack wasn't random. It was calculated. Monasteries were wealthy. They held gold, silver, illuminated manuscripts, and religious treasures. They were also undefended. Monks didn't carry swords. They prayed for protection. That protection didn't come. The scholar Alcuin of York, who was in Charlemagne's court at the time, wrote in horror. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. This wasn't just an attack. It was sacrilege. It was unthinkable. And it was just the beginning. Word spread quickly through Scandinavia. The raid had been wildly successful. The riches were real. The defenses were weak. Within years, Viking raids were happening all along the coasts of England, Ireland, and France. No coastal settlement was safe. Churches and monasteries became prime targets because that's where the wealth was concentrated. The pattern was always the same. Strike fast. Hit hard. Take everything of value. Disappear before any organized defense could respond. The Vikings had turned raiding into an art form. But here's what most people don't understand, raiding was just the beginning. The Vikings weren't just destroyers. They were builders. Traders. Settlers. And in the coming decades, they wouldn't just raid Europe. They would become part of it. The storm from the north had arrived. And nothing would ever be the same. Here's the part they don't teach you in school. While Viking raiders were terrorizing the coasts of Europe, other Vikings were building one of the most sophisticated trading networks the medieval world had ever seen. The same ships that carried warriors also carried merchants. And those merchants were traveling distances that would astonish you. Viking traders sailed east down the rivers of Russia. They portaged their ships over land between river systems. They reached the Caspian Sea. They traded with the Arab Caliphate in Baghdad. They dealt in furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves. In return, they brought back silver. Enormous amounts of silver. Archaeologists have found over 80,000 Arab silver coins in Scandinavia. That's not from raiding. That's from trade. The Vikings established trading towns that became legendary. Birka in Sweden. Hedeby in Denmark. Koppang in Norway. Dublin in Ireland, which started as a Viking settlement. These weren't crude camps. They were cosmopolitan centers where you could meet traders from Byzantium, the Arab world, the Frankish kingdoms, and the Baltic regions. The Vikings were running a medieval globalized economy. But here's the crucial part, the same culture that produced traders also produced raiders. Often, they were the same people. A Viking crew might trade peacefully at one port and raid the next settlement down the coast. It all depended on opportunity, strength, and calculation. The Vikings were pragmatic. If trade was profitable and safe, they traded. If a target was weak and wealthy, they raided. Morality didn't enter the equation the way we might expect. By the 860s, something changed. The raids weren't hit and run anymore. In 865, the Great Heathen Army landed in England. This wasn't a raiding party. This was an invasion force. Thousands of warriors. Multiple kings and chieftains. Ivar the Boneless. Halfdan Ragnarsson. Ubba. Names that would become legendary. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it the Great Heathen Army, and with good reason. This force didn't come to raid and leave. They came to conquer and settle. And they nearly succeeded. Within a decade, they had conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. 3 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell. Only Wessex, under a young king named Alfred, held out. The stories from this period are brutal. King Edmund of East Anglia was captured and, according to legend, killed for refusing to renounce his Christian faith. The Vikings allegedly tied him to a tree and shot him full of arrows. Whether the story is true or propaganda, it shows how the Anglo-Saxons saw their enemy. As ruthless, pagan, and unstoppable. But Alfred was no ordinary king. He reorganized his forces. He built fortified towns called Buz. He created a navy to fight the Vikings on their own terms. And in 878, at the Battle of Edington, he defeated the Great Heathen Army and forced their leader, Guthrum, to accept baptism and a peace treaty. The result was the Danelaw, a huge portion of England where Viking law and custom ruled. York became Jorvik, a thriving Viking city. Norse and Anglo-Saxon communities lived side by side, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. The cultural exchange went both ways. Vikings adopted Christianity. Anglo-Saxons adopted Viking words, many of which we still use today: sky, knife, window, husband, law. This is where the narrative gets complicated. The Vikings weren't just foreign invaders anymore. They were becoming English. Irish. French. They were settling down, marrying local women, having children, building communities. Yes, they still fought. Medieval Europe was violent for everyone. But they were also farming, trading, and building towns. In France, the situation was similar. Viking raiders had been attacking the Frankish coast for decades. The Frankish kings tried everything. Paying them off, fighting them, fortifying towns. Nothing worked permanently. Finally, in 911, King Charles the Simple made a deal with a Viking leader named Rollo. He gave Rollo a large territory in northern France in exchange for protection against other Vikings and nominal loyalty to the French crown. That territory became Normandy. The land of the Northmen. Within a few generations, these Vikings had adopted French language, French customs, and French Christianity. But they kept their warrior culture and organizational skills. And in 1066, the descendants of these Vikings, now calling themselves Normans, would conquer England under William the Conqueror. The circle was complete. Vikings who had settled in France conquered the Anglo-Saxons, who themselves had been fighting Vikings for 2 centuries. The Viking Age wasn't just about destruction. It was about transformation. These seafaring raiders became traders, settlers, and kingdom builders. They didn't just change Europe through violence. They changed it through cultural exchange, economic integration, and political innovation. The question is, were they still Vikings? Or had they become something new entirely? The answer would define the next century of European history. While Vikings in the east were trading with Baghdad and Vikings in the west were conquering England, others were pushing into waters no European had ever sailed. This is where the Viking story becomes almost unbelievable. These weren't just raiders or traders. They were explorers on a scale that wouldn't be matched for centuries. It started with Iceland. Around 870, Norse settlers began arriving on this volcanic island in the North Atlantic. According to the sagas, a Norwegian chieftain named Ingolfur Arnarson was the first permanent settler. Why would anyone sail into the unknown to settle a land of ice and fire? The same reasons as always: land, freedom, and opportunity. Norway was becoming unified under King Harald Fairhair, and many Norse chieftains refused to bend the knee. They chose exile over submission. Iceland became a unique experiment. No king ruled there. Instead, the settlers created the Althing in 930, one of the world's oldest parliaments. Free farmers gathered each year to make laws, settle disputes, and conduct business. It wasn't democracy as we understand it, but it was remarkable for its time. The Vikings weren't just warriors. They were creating new forms of governance. But Iceland wasn't the end of the journey. It was a stepping stone. Around 985, a man named Eric the Red was exiled from Iceland for murder. Instead of accepting defeat, he sailed west and discovered a massive landmass. He named it Greenland, a marketing strategy, really, since much of it was ice-covered. But the coastal areas had fjords and grasslands suitable for farming. Eric returned to Iceland and convinced nearly 500 people to join him. 25 ships set out. Only 14 made it. The North Atlantic didn't forgive mistakes. The Greenland settlements survived for nearly 500 years. They raised cattle and sheep. They traded walrus ivory back to Europe. They built churches when they converted to Christianity. And from Greenland, they would make the most astonishing voyage of all. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland. According to the sagas, he had heard tales from a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course and spotted land to the west. Leif decided to investigate. What he found was North America. 500 years before Columbus. Let that sink in. Leif and his crew explored 3 regions they named Helluland, land of flat stones, probably Baffin Island. Markland, land of forests, likely Labrador. And Vinland, land of wine, where they found wild grapes and decided to establish a settlement. For years, this was considered legend. Viking fairy tales. Then, in 1960, archaeologists discovered L'Anse-aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. Definitive proof. Norse buildings. Norse artifacts. The Vikings had reached America. But they didn't stay. The sagas tell us why. They called the indigenous people they encountered Skraelings, and relations quickly turned hostile. The Vikings were tough, but they were vastly outnumbered, thousands of miles from any support. After a few years and several violent encounters, they abandoned Vinland. The settlement failed, but the achievement remained. The Vikings had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in open boats and reached a new continent. This puts the Viking Age in perspective. While they were raiding monasteries in Ireland, they were also sailing to America. While they were settling in England, they were trading with the Middle East. The scope of Viking activity was truly global for its time. Meanwhile, in the East, Vikings were writing another chapter. Swedish Vikings, known as the Russ, had been traveling down the river systems of Eastern Europe for generations. They established trading posts that became cities: Novgorod, Kiev, Smolensk. These weren't just traders. They became the ruling class of the Slavic peoples, creating what would eventually become Russia. The very name, Russia, comes from Rus, the Vikings. The most ambitious of these Eastern Vikings traveled all the way to Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world. Byzantium was wealth and power beyond imagination. Massive walls. Golden domes. Libraries. Markets filled with silk and spices. The Byzantine emperors had a problem, though. They couldn't fully trust their own people for their personal protection. Palace coups were common. So they did something clever. They hired foreign warriors who had no local political connections and no stake in Byzantine power struggles. Enter the Varangian Guard. An elite unit of Scandinavian warriors who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards. To be chosen for the Varangian Guard was the highest honor a Viking warrior could achieve. The pay was excellent. The prestige was unmatched. And the stories they brought back to Scandinavia inspired generations. The sagas speak of Harald Hardrada, who served in the Varangian Guard, fought in battles across the Mediterranean, grew wealthy, and returned to Norway to become king. By the mid-11th century, Vikings had been to 4 continents. They had founded cities that still exist today. They had served emperors, created kingdoms, and reached America. They had gone from raiders on the coast of England to integral parts of European, Asian, and even North African history. But the world was changing. And the Viking Age was approaching its final, dramatic act. By the year 1000, something fundamental had changed in Scandinavia. The age of independent chieftains and raiding parties was giving way to something new, centralized kingdoms. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were consolidating under powerful monarchs. And these kings understood that to rule effectively in medieval Europe, you needed more than just warriors. You needed the church. Christianity was spreading through Scandinavia, sometimes peacefully, often by force. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway was notorious for his conversion methods. He gave people a choice, baptism or death. Destroy your pagan idols or face execution. It sounds brutal, and it was, but Olaf understood political reality. Christian kings could form alliances with other Christian kingdoms. They could legitimize their rule through divine right. They could tap into the administrative power of the church. His successor, Olaf II Haraldsson, would later become Saint Olaf, Norway's patron saint. Think about that transformation. From pagan raiders who terrorized Christian monasteries to a Christian saint, all within a few generations. The Vikings were being absorbed into European Christendom, but they were doing it on their own terms, maintaining their warrior culture while adopting new religious and political structures. Denmark became the greatest power in the north under Sweyn Forkbeard and his son, Knut the Great. These weren't just Viking raiders. They were empire builders. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard invaded England and forced the Anglo-Saxon king, Ethelred the Unready, into exile. Sweyn died shortly after, but his son Knut inherited the throne. By 1016, Knut was king of England. By 1018, he was king of Denmark. By 1028, he controlled Norway. The North Sea had become a Viking lake, and Knut ruled the greatest maritime empire in Europe. But here's what's remarkable, Knut wasn't a barbarian conqueror. He was a sophisticated ruler. He kept Anglo-Saxon laws and customs. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of the previous English king, legitimizing his rule. He patronized the church, making generous donations and going on pilgrimage to Rome. He minted coins with Christian imagery. He turned Viking military power into political authority. There's a famous story about Knut. His courtiers were flattering him excessively, calling him the greatest king on earth. To teach them humility, Knut had his throne placed on the beach and commanded the tide to stop. Of course, the waves kept coming and soaked his feet. He turned to his courtiers and said, "Let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings, for there is none worthy of the name but he whom heaven, earth, and sea obey." Whether the story is true or not, it reveals how Nut wanted to be remembered, not as a pagan Viking raider, but as a Christian king who understood the limits of earthly power. He was constructing a new identity for his people. But empires built on personal power are fragile. When Nut died in 1035, his empire began to fracture. His sons fought over the inheritance. Within a decade, the North Sea Empire had collapsed. England returned to Anglo-Saxon rule under Edward the Confessor. Denmark and Norway went their separate ways. The brief moment of Viking imperial unity was over. Yet the ambition remained. And one man would make one final, catastrophic attempt to reclaim Viking glory. Harald Sigurdsson earned the nickname Hardrada, hard ruler, and he earned it through blood. This man had one of the most extraordinary lives in medieval history. As a teenager, he fought at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, where his half-brother, Saint Olaf, was killed. Wounded and defeated, Harald fled Norway. He traveled east to Kiev, then joined the Varangian Guard in Constantinople. For 15 years, he fought for the Byzantine emperors. He battled in the Mediterranean, Sicily, and the Holy Land. He grew wealthy from plunder and payment. The sagas say he was nearly 7 feet tall, a giant among men, a warrior of legendary skill. Whether or not that's exaggerated, Harald was formidable. In 1046, he returned to Scandinavia and seized the throne of Norway. For 20 years, he ruled with an iron fist, centralizing power and crushing opposition. But Harald wanted more. He had never forgotten that his nephew, Magnus, had briefly ruled both Norway and Denmark. Harald believed he had a claim to England as well, through old agreements between Nut's family and his own. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada invaded England with a fleet of 300 ships and around 10,000 men. This was the last great Viking invasion. Harald won an initial victory at Fulford, defeating the northern English earls. York surrendered. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Viking Age might have one final triumph. Then King Harold Godwin, son of England, did something remarkable. He force-marched his army nearly 200 miles in 4 days. On September 25, 1066, at Stamford Bridge, he caught the Vikings completely by surprise. They had left much of their armor on the ships. It was a hot day. They weren't expecting a fight. The battle was brutal. The Vikings fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and unprepared. Harald Hardrada was struck in the throat by an arrow and died on the field. His son Olaf survived and was allowed to leave with the remnants of the army. They had come in 300 ships. They left in 24. Harald Hardrada was the last of the great Viking warrior. Harold Godwin's son had to march his exhausted army south immediately. On October 14, at the Battle of Hastings, Harold was killed and William conquered England. William was a Norman. His ancestors were Vikings who had settled in France just 150 years earlier. So in the end, Vikings did conquer England in 1066. They just did it as Normans, not as Norsemen. The Viking Age didn't end with a whimper. It ended with a transformation. The raiders had become kings. The pagans had become Christians. The outsiders had become the establishment. The storm from the north had finally passed. But it had changed everything. So what did 3 centuries of Viking activity actually accomplish? The easy answer is destruction. Monasteries burned. Kingdoms fell. Thousands died. But that's only half the story, and maybe not even the important half. The Vikings didn't just take from Europe. They fundamentally reshaped it. Start with the political map. Before the Vikings, England was 7 separate kingdoms. The Viking invasions forced the Anglo-Saxons to unite under Wessex to survive. That unity eventually became the Kingdom of England. Without Viking pressure, England as we know it might never have existed. The same pattern played out across Europe. The need to defend against Viking raids led to the construction of fortified towns, professional armies, and stronger centralized governments. In Ireland, the Vikings founded Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick, Ireland's first true cities. Before the Vikings, Ireland was entirely rural, organized around monasteries and tribal territories. The Norse brought urbanization, maritime trade, and connection to the wider European economy. They transformed Irish society even as they became Irish themselves. Russia's very existence traces back to the Swedish Vikings, the Rus, who established the first organized states among the Slavic peoples. The primary chronicle of Kievan Rus records that the Slavic tribes invited Scandinavian rulers to bring order. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. Whether that's accurate history or later propaganda, the fact remains that the founders of the Russian state were Vikings. Trade routes expanded dramatically. Before the Vikings, European trade was mostly local and regional. The Vikings connected the North Atlantic with the Mediterranean, the Baltic with the Middle East. They didn't just move goods. They moved ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Arabic silver flowed into Scandinavia. Scandinavian furs and slaves reached Baghdad. Byzantine art influenced Norse craftsmen. This was globalization, medieval style. The English language carries Viking DNA in thousands of words we use every day. Sky. Egg. Knife. Window. Husband. Anger. Ugly. Die. Take. Get. These aren't exotic loan words. They're fundamental vocabulary. Parts of England still use Scandinavian grammatical structures. The Vikings didn't just visit. They changed how people spoke. Place names tell the same story. Any English town ending in by, Thorpe, or Thwaite is Viking in origin. Derby. Grimsby. Scunthorpe. Keswick derives from cheese farm in Old Norse. York was Jorvik. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're evidence of settlement, of families living and farming and building communities. The Vikings became English, but they left their mark on the landscape forever. In Normandy, the situation was similar but more dramatic. Within 2 generations, the Vikings who settled there had abandoned Old Norse entirely and spoke French. But they kept their organizational genius and martial culture. When they conquered England in 1066, they brought continental feudalism, Norman architecture, and a new ruling class. The English language absorbed thousands of French words. The entire structure of English society changed. And at the root of all this were Vikings who had settled in France just 150 years earlier. The cultural exchange went both ways. The Vikings who settled in Christian lands converted to Christianity, but they brought their values with them. The Norse emphasis on personal honor, loyalty to one's lord, and prowess in battle meshed perfectly with emerging medieval chivalric ideals. The knight's code of honor owes something to both Christian theology and pagan Norse warrior culture. For centuries after the Viking Age ended, the Norse were remembered primarily as destroyers. Christian chroniclers who wrote the histories depicted them as God's punishment for sin, pagan monsters, the scourge of civilization. It's only in the past 150 years that archaeology and more careful historical analysis have revealed the full picture. The ships, the settlements, the trade goods, the sophisticated craftsmanship, all of it tells a more complex story than the chronicles alone. Here's what the Vikings were not: they didn't wear horned helmets. That's a 19th century romantic invention. They weren't mindless barbarians. They were literate in runes, sophisticated in their craftsmanship, and complex in their social organization. They weren't all raiders. Most were farmers and traders who never left Scandinavia. And they didn't suddenly disappear. They evolved, adapted, and became part of the European mainstream. But here's what they were: opportunistic, pragmatic, and remarkably adaptable. They could be brutal when brutality served their purposes. The raids were real. The violence was real. Entire communities were destroyed, people were enslaved, and cultural treasures were lost forever. We shouldn't romanticize that. At the same time, they were explorers who reached America 5 centuries before Columbus. They were traders who connected disparate parts of the medieval world. They were settlers who built new societies and blended cultures. They were craftsmen who created art of stunning beauty. They were poets who composed sagas that still resonate today. They were all of these things, often simultaneously, sometimes contradictorily. The Viking Age lasted roughly from 793 to 1066. 3 centuries. In that time, Scandinavian peoples went from peripheral raiders to integral parts of European civilization. They founded kingdoms, cities, and trade networks. They explored farther than any Europeans before them. And then they transformed so completely that within a few generations, their descendants were indistinguishable from the peoples they had once raided. The Viking Age didn't end because the Vikings were defeated. It ended because the Vikings stopped being Vikings. They converted to Christianity. They adopted feudalism. They built stone churches instead of sailing to raid them. They became kings and counts and dukes. The raiders became the establishment. But their impact echoes through history. Every time you use a word with Norse origins. Every time you see a place name ending in by or thorpe. Every time you think about the founding of Russia, the unification of England, or the Norman conquest. Every time you remember that Europeans reached America centuries before the age of Columbus. The Vikings are there, just beneath the surface of history. They were called the Northmen. The foreigners. The heathens. The pagans. But they were also explorers, traders, craftsmen, poets, and kings. They terrorized Europe. And then, quietly, permanently, they shaped it into something new. That's the truth behind history's most feared raiders. They weren't just destroyers. They were transformers. And the world they helped create is still the world we live in today. The dragon ships have long since rotted away. The great halls have collapsed. The warriors are dust. But the Viking Age? It never really ended. It just changed form. And if you know where to look, you can still see their fingerprints everywhere.